Tonight, this video showing another deadly U.S. military strike against a boat allegedly smuggling drugs to the U.S., killing 2 narco-terrorists on board, according to Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. President Trump tonight suggesting he'll soon order strikes on cartels smuggling drugs by land, too.
Welcome, I'm Ben Boyce, and this is the Dr. Junkie Show. First, a couple updates. Our CU Denver in-prison college program is back up and running at 2 different facilities in Colorado, and that's kept me pretty busy the last few months alongside my regular campus classes. The first semester that students in college take, it's a cool experience to witness, especially in prison, because it's when something like half of those students find something that they weren't really looking for or that they didn't know they were looking for: empowerment, identity, purpose, friendship, sometimes even themselves. So that's been really fun. But now it's break time, Christmas break to be exact. And while I'm gearing up for this new semester, I'm also gearing up for a brand new class that's called Communication and Drugs. So if you're on campus at CU Denver, think about taking it. I pitched it last year and it finally got approval, so I'm going to dive into that around 4 weeks from now. Which means I got a lot of work to do, but this podcast is often part of that work. So what better place to start than with what's going on in Venezuela? That's probably where I'll start this class. If you've been watching the news, you've probably heard that we've been using Hellfire missiles that cost something like $150,000 each to blow up boats thousands of miles away from the U.S. mainland because, according to our government, those boats are filled with dangerous drugs and piloted by drug traffickers. Of course, in our hyper-partisan mediascape, we get this in 2 basic formats. On the right, we hear celebrations of patriotism and righteous killings, along with reminders of why these lives don't matter as much as others, why this isn't actually murder. And on the left, we're offered a smorgasbord of indignation, disgust at calloused murder, or aggravation at the suspense of due process, or doubt at unsubstantiated claims, or just eye-rolling at the high price tag for what could have been accomplished with a simple arrest. Stuff like that. But underneath all this media bias is what's really going on, the real reason for these killings, the real reason those in charge are talking about them like they are. So let's dive in and let's start with Foucault. I know, right? It's like I just can't talk about something that's going on in the world without adding theory from some dusty dead dude, but trust me, this one's worth a thought. Now, Foucault's work was all about power, specifically how it shapes, exercises, and redirects us in the real world. When I say power, I'm keeping it simple, and I'm just using that term to mean the ability to get something or someone to move. A diesel truck has a lot of power because it can cause rocks or groceries or people to move from one spot to another. A politician has power if they can do the same thing. So Foucault didn't see power as something that someone holds. He saw it as fluid, fluctuating, always under attack from all sides. I mean, no one achieves a position of power and finds it completely unwanted by others. It wouldn't really be a position of power if that was the case. So exercising power is maybe the easiest part of this to understand, and it also gives us an idea of what we mean by power. What exactly is it that's under attack? What is it that people want once I'm put in that position of power? Well, it's my ability to get certain things to move, especially if you happen to be one of those things. So I like to think of Foucault's notion of power as a pod, like a porta-potty-sized room with dials and buttons and gears on the wall, knobs and levers on the ceiling, and all sorts of little switches labeled with different names that apply to the person who's in that pod. And that's the trick. Who exactly is allowed in that specific pod? Now, with me, I have a lot of different pod access. I can get into, say, the power of teacher in college. And this pod has dials and levers like label students good or bad, as behaved or unruly, as a cheater or as a good student. As a teacher approved by the institution, I'm in charge of flipping the dials. You get an A, a B, a D. What grade did you earn? Those buttons and levers also allow me to get students into a classroom, or to make them create homework assignments of my choosing, or even to make them read or watch content. All of that's possible only because of the institution I represent, in this case education, which has okayed me to be a representative. And of course, students would love to have that power themselves. They'd love to just check the boxes for me and say, I'm a straight A student. I was the best student he ever had. Power is always under attack. And then I finish up this class in the educational institution, and I head home from prison or the campus where I teach at, and immediately I exit one pod, the teacher pod, with buttons like grades and academic probation and kick somebody out of class. I leave that pod and I enter the citizen and the driver pod to go home. And in that pod, I have literal buttons and dials, like the steering wheel, for example, and I'm required to follow certain rules or else my access to that pod will be taken by the institution in charge of it, just like my teaching pod. My access can be revoked if I don't continue to perform up to the institution's standards. Power's always under threat. I'm always being watched, labeled, evaluated by people in the pod of department chair, university dean, people on social media, where I can be liked or disliked, commented on and shared, ignored, buried. It's institutions all the way down. And then, of course, I get home and I enter the pod of father, and if my son's done something that I need to correct him on, I have to access some of those buttons. Or I enter the pod of media consumer when I start flipping through the news, coming to believe what the station aligned with my particular political beliefs echoes, and maybe buying the products they try to sell me in commercials, because the pod of mainstream media has buttons like, sell this guy a gun or an insurance policy. And then I run to the grocery store and I become a commodity consumer, with buttons like, buy, use a coupon, write a review on Yelp, steal that candy bar. All these things I can do from that position, from that pod of institutional power. Some of those things are acceptable while others aren't. If I, for example, decide to press the drive 30 miles an hour over the speed limit, or steal everything, or just give students you don't like D-minuses, if I push those buttons, there's a good chance I'm going to be noticed and snitched on by others in the same pod, or by people in a different pod who happen to have a snitch button. Most pods today actually have a snitch button built in because in our day and age, and Foucault's system only survives this way, all of us are keeping an eye on all of us. Everybody is watching everybody else and using our buttons to discipline them when they fall out of line. We either snitch on them or we deal with it ourselves. Maybe we stop buying barbecue from the local guy because he tells us a racist joke. True story. Or maybe we boycott the local grocer when it refuses to pay a living wage. All buttons and levers that are built into the consumer pod. So that's the basics of what Foucault calls panoptic institutional power, as explained using, let's call it Boyce's theory of power pods. It's worth noting that the person who has access to any pod, it doesn't really matter. The president pod, for example, it can be Biden or Obama or Trump, but that pod, president, it has a nuke button, blow up boats in the ocean button, get your supporters to raid the Capitol because you're a baby who doesn't want to admit you're lost button. It doesn't matter who the president is, they can all access that pod and use all of its buttons by way of their institutional power as long as they have that institutional access, the approval to go in and push any button you want. The panopticon part, in Foucault's world, has to do with how the system makes us all feel like we're always being watched, surveilled, judged, labeled, largely because we are. Now, the institutional aspect is an important part of Foucault's theory. Institutions are just large groups of people, and as we kind of discovered as humans, 150,000 years ago, the easiest way for someone to avoid being abused by the biggest guy in town is to just join together with a bunch of other people and kill the bully. So today, says Foucault, that's still where we're at. Institutional power is basically all there is, big groups of people. So if you think about your values, your hobbies, your morals, your religion, your job, your lifestyle, your friends and how they judge you, These things are all values based on stories you have from institutions about institutions. I mean, why should you even go to work today if you don't feel like it? Because the institution might label you a slacker and a no-show if you don't go, and you might actually get fired. And it might even make it impossible to get another job down the road if they call them for a reference. Now, are you sure they'll notice, or that even if they do, they'll give you a bad reference or fire you? Well, no. But the system is designed so that we always think it's possible. We always feel like somebody might be watching. The institution in charge of labeling you a success or a failure, a good guy or a bad guy, it might discover some information about you that causes it to reclassify you if you're not careful. Oh no. So the institutional story directs you. Why do you feel compelled to go to church on Sunday? Because you know that the institution expects you to. And if you don't, they'll probably notice. Some of them might remember. They might talk about you behind your back. Did you see Ben skip church again? He's probably home sinning. The institutional story will compel you to follow a set of rules or to deal with the consequences. I've talked about this before, so instead of driving this point into the ground, or further into the ground, if you want to hear more about this, you can go back a couple episodes and listen to the recent Panopticon pieces. But for now, the important part is that institutions are everything when it comes to power. They make the rules because who else is there? The only thing that can threaten an institution is more institutions, more groups of people. Different cultures in different eras are controlled by different institutions and different goals within those institutions. A few times a week in the warmer months here in Denver, I ride my bicycle to campus to avoid paying for parking. And on these rides, which are about 9 miles each way through downtown Denver, I inevitably pass some guy who's smoking weed or injecting dope on the sidewalk. I actually am one of those guys, so who am I trying to fool? So I get it, I'm cool with it, but imagine if I wasn't, if I decided to shoot one of these guys because they were sitting there getting high. Well, I'd probably go to prison for murder. The institution of law would label me a criminal. And I'd also be viewed as a bad person by most of my culture because in the United States, we draw this kind of false distinction between drug users and dealers. We pretend to have compassion for the users, even though we don't, while we also have clear contempt for suspected dealers. But even those hated dealers, I mean, we might lock them in prison forever and talk mad smack about them around our dinner tables, but we don't give people the death penalty in the United States for dealing drugs, or even for trafficking drugs. You might see where I'm headed here. Now, there are and have been plenty of cultures in the past and even contemporarily where drug users and dealers are treated far different than they are here. And the United States hasn't always actually been that nice to drug dealers itself. So you might remember some of my previous talks about Duterte, the ex-president of the Philippines, who's now in jail in The Hague, charged with crimes against humanity, because when he was in power between 2016 and 2022, he would frequently brag about killing and encouraging his officers to kill drug users and drug dealers, extrajudicial killings they called it. And these dudes were brutal. They were cruel. They would murder drug users and then just leave their bodies sitting outside their family's house overnight so they'd have to come deal with them in the morning. And, surprise, or not, he never got rid of drug use. But he did use institutional power, in this case, the presidency, to tell a story about drug users and dealers that devalued their lives so much that many people in his country didn't even care when they were murdered. And on the flip side, his arrest by the International Criminal Court, an institution, it also created knowledge. It serves as a sign to other would-be drug warriors who might think about killing people without due process that they might want to think twice. And the only way to combat institutional knowledge is with other institutional knowledge. Enter Hot Mess Hegseth. Our institutional stories about dealers and users might change depending on time, space, history, and, most of all, the stories that are told in those times, spaces, and histories by the institutions who are in power. So to add the final piece to this, that's usually considered more confusing than it is, knowledge power. Foucault thought of those two things as the same thing, or I guess a better way to say it would be as inseparable. You can't have knowledge in a world without power, and you can't have power in a world without knowledge. If you want to know if extralegal killings of drug users by a president is acceptable in 2025, you'll actually have a hard time avoiding the current labels put on Duterte by the International Criminal Court, the institution, the representatives of power who created that knowledge. So let's look briefly at how power can and does produce knowledge, and then I want to talk about how that knowledge goes on to shape the behavior of people down the road. Let's start with a simple example. Say, I want to get people to stay off my lawn, and I just can't find any success. I don't have a button in my Ben pod that works to keep those damn kids off my lawn. I've tried everything, y'all. I shot them with paintballs the other day. I sicked my Chihuahua Ponch on them. I even turned the sprinklers on them. They just danced in the rain. So now what? Well, Foucault would say I might want to skip all that heavy work and instead take the easier route and just stay in my house. Knowing that we all live in this institutional world I'm describing, where all of our behaviors, beliefs, actions, and attitudes are largely grounded in what we are worried others might think about us. Will they think I'm a slacker, a bad feminist, a shitty teacher, a bad parent? Knowing that, says Foucault, why not work this system backwards and just have one or more of these institutions whip up some new knowledge for you? A news story that says, for example, if you stand on someone named Ben's lawn, you're anti-American, a jerk-faced clown. Whoa, says Foucault. That would actually prevent Ben from having to do anything, because once the knowledge exists, it's going to weasel its way into their little brains like an RFK worm, and they'll make themselves stay off my grass. Now that's power. Actually, that's knowledge power. Now for an example a bit stronger than keeping my grass alive, we've all lived with a war on drugs our entire lives. I mean, it sounds wild, but no one alive today has ever lived in a world where an all-out war on drugs and those who use them wasn't a thing. Nowadays, we just take it for granted because so many institutions are aligned on the story that the war on drugs is a good thing. The police do arrest drug dealers after all. The educational system teaches students why drugs are bad. The medical establishment, it identifies the physical dangers and labels the addictions. The religious institutions, they stigmatize us as weak or as evil. It's institutions all the way down. So to get back to these drug boats, most of the world's cocaine comes from Peru, Bolivia, and Colombia, not Venezuela. Very little of the world's fentanyl comes from any of these countries, and even though Venezuela probably does wind up being the place where something like 5 to 10% of the cocaine produced in Colombia gets shipped out to sea, it's not the place you'd start if your goal was really to stem the flow of drugs into the United States. So there's this glaring inconsistency with the story. We're blowing up alleged cocaine boats to fight a war against fentanyl, the real danger quick to slip out of any politician's lips whenever they can make a political buck off it, at least until now anyway. And clearly the president isn't doing this because he has a beef with cocaine traffickers. I mean, he literally just pardoned ex-president of Honduras, Juan Hernandez, who was supposed to be serving a 45-year sentence in prison after being convicted in a U.S. court of drug trafficking and conspiring with drug traffickers to smuggle tons of cocaine, literally tons, into the United States. Law and order, right? Anyway, maybe the president of Venezuela said something mean about President Trump's hair, or maybe it's the oil in Venezuela. Venezuela does have the largest verified reserves on Earth, although there's a lot of logistical issues with us ever making money off that. Or maybe there's really drugs on these boats, and there's a good reason for starting this sort of war here instead of elsewhere. The problem is, from our position as citizens, we can't know enough to really say, at least not at this point in history. So for now, I'll leave the guessing to the pundits, to those far left and right news stations who make their money off getting people to argue. What I want to think about is the result of these killings from Foucault's perspective, from knowledge power. We can recognize the knowledge that's being created by institutional authorities in real time, and we can even spot how it invades our brains and winds up shaping our beliefs, our morals. Hey, Pete, can you go kill some dudes in the middle of the ocean, brag about it, and then insist they were drug traffickers? Can you make your institution create some knowledge for me? That, like Duterte's government, we hate drug dealers so much that we actually think their lives are worthless. That this bipartisan war on drugs, one of the few issues in this country that remain supported by both sides of the political spectrum for the most part, the knowledge is that it's ramping up yet again. We're now headed toward an actual war on drugs. Forget the arresting of dealers and the help for addicted folks. Let's get out the bombs and the $1 million drones. It's murder time. So if you want to get into the heads of drug traffickers across the world, you might want to create this sort of knowledge that trafficking is often a death sentence. Just use the institution of the military to kill them, and then defend it as good. And then use the institution of media to widely distribute the images and stories because, in the United States, spectacle sells. And then use the institution of the executive branch to bolster the story that you're a hero and that these were monsters. I mean, if you really want to show how little value these guys have, you might even have a few situations where, say, you blow them up once, and then we come back 45 minutes and blow them up again as the survivors are clinging to the boat trying to survive. But it's not a war crime, says the pundits. It's more like a extrajudicial killing. Where have I heard that term before? You know, I often find myself lately thinking about how that dehumanization process works, how it's working right now. If instead of waking up to spectacles of explosions and neon night vision, what if we were all waking up to high-definition, full-color SEAL Team 6 rappelling down ropes and executing pilots who have their hands raised in surrender? What if they only grazed a couple of them, threw them off the boat, and then let them swim back to the boat, only to kill them as they clung on for life, say an hour later? Would we feel any different as citizens if that was the case? If we're principled, that scenario should be no different than the current one. We shouldn't let the distance of these killings callous us. As much as I hate many of the finer workings of our criminal justice system, I also recognize that it's a step away from this kind of cold-blooded shit, that it's far better than this sort of avatar murder carried out from a computer monitor in mom's basement 1,000 miles away. That's a path I thought this country had already gone too far down and then retreated, repented. Remember Obama's scandals with Guantanamo? I thought we were all ashamed of that. But maybe I just underestimated the ability of regular citizens to completely dehumanize someone based on nothing other than an allegation that they were selling drugs. I'll talk about this more in the future, I'm sure, but it felt like a good place to pick the mic back up and chat. So I'll talk to y'all soon. I'm Ben Boyce.
Candidate Trump promised the big oil executives that he would deliver their wish list if they spent $1 billion to return him to the White House.